It's always interesting to meet the author of an important book, because after one has heard the author speaking, as one reads the book, one can hear the voice of the author and one can get a feel for how the author thinks and writes. And so it's my great pleasure today to have with us Nicolas Ludovicos, who is a Greek theologian who works in Greece, and he has written this book, which I consider to be one of the most interesting books on Christian spirituality and what we mean by the incarnation that I have read in many years. And with him, I have Mark Spencer from the United States and an old friend and colleague of mine, Andreas Andreopoulos from the University of Winchester. You're all very welcome. Nicolas, tell me something about what led you to write this book.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you for this discussion and for your good words. It's a good question. This book has a long story behind it. As you perhaps know, I started as a psychologist who switched to philosophy and then finally to theology. And somehow this history is imprinted upon this book. I could say just briefly, starting first from psychoanalysis, what was my I can say I was hooded in psychoanalysis as a psychologist by the impasse of narcissism. Narcissism is something that we meet in every analytic relationship. And in this sense, narcissism is the oxygen of the soul, but at this very same moment, it can, soul can be absolutely, suffocation because of the narcissism. So why? Because narcissism has to deal with the other, it's dealing with the other. But at the same time, it does this by using the desire, which is the will. And this will, this is a great discovery of psychoanalysis, is centripetal, always. While it seems to be centrifugal, that means that it's always dialectic. It somehow it takes into account the other, but at the very same moment, it subjugates him, subjugates the other. And somehow, in this way, mature subjectivity, by using this narcissistic will or desire, which is something almost unavoidable for a human being without grace, of course, in its physical condition, it's founded subjectivity in a sort of serial killing. It kills constantly the other, it uses the other, while it pretends that he wants the other, he somehow wants to please the other. If and in this sense, desire is something that always uses the other for orientation, while at the very same moment it somehow reduces the other to a sort of mirroring, a mirror of my own construction of subjectivity. So that was the first somehow experience that I had. The second came from philosophy, especially from Heidegger, or better, Nietzsche, where I studied Heidegger, and I had this spiritual, understanding of his thought, in the sense that the will is the only way of a self-realization, as sort of inner transcendence, willing to be more. And that means that for the Western metaphysics, both philosophically and psychologically, in a sense, ontologically, will is the very essence of human being. So if this is true, then we have to deal with the will when we come to theology. And it was a sort of second discovery that, in a sense, will to power, as described by Nietzsche, is not unconnected with Christianity, with a certain way of understanding Christianity. And this is the basically Platonic form of Christianity that was known from the beginning. A book of mine was published in Greek 2 weeks ago called Unseen Harmony. And the subtitle is A Metaphysical History of Ancient Greek Philosophy, where I try to describe this love for Platonism that somehow runs through Christian, ancient Greek thought, at the very same moment, the fear for Platonism, which goes in a parallel way. So, in this sense, Plato runs through 1,000 years of Greek thought. And the very same moment, he's undermined by the very best of his pupils, Aristotle, by a series of other philosophers that somehow, like the Stoics, like the Epicureans, that tried somehow to turn the Greek spirit to the things themselves, in a sense, instead of just escaping them. And so the last word of the Greek Platonic thought was again Platonism, with Plotinus and the others, trying to somehow solve the Gordian knot of the old Platonism, which is the impossibility of participating in the one, as I am. I have to lose my bodily existence just through my soul, and my soul cannot reach the one just through contemplation, without mixing with a commixture of the one and me. By putting, this is what Plotinus does, by putting somehow in a very in a sort of identification the ego and the one becomes the ego becomes the one. So, but this did not help the Greek metaphysics. Why? Because this ego is not real. It's not me. So this somehow transcendent, this detached ego, was transferred in Christianity through Origen. And this is how the book starts, with all these experiences of the problem of the will, and what shall we do with the will, which becomes a sort of, self-realization, but in what context? The context is Platonic. And if we put those things together, then we create a subject that it is somehow divided into a greater part, which is the most important and the most, say, rich and the most invaluable, and the other part which has to be dominated in order for the will to function as this sort of ecstasis toward the one or toward the Christian God. This was brought into the Christian anthropology through Origen, and in the West through Augustine, who is, for me, is a disciple of Origen in his basics. And of course, I have to note here that it's important for me that I write as a historian of ideas. It's not, for me, what is absolutely important at this moment is to gain, to earn the primordial Christian experience, the biblical Christian experience, which is, for me, fascinating and very needed for the world. But in order to do this, we have somehow to realize the basic problems that somehow marked the genesis of the Christian subject, which is a Christian subject in a sense that at the very same moment, it's a transcendental subject, using the will in a Platonic context, if I can say this. So in this sense, I was looking for solutions, and solutions come from many parts of Christian, but I used some of the most neglected, which is for me Maximus the Confessor, first of all, and this line of thought that comes through Simeon the New Theologian, and without neglecting Thomas Aquinas, which is very important, who is very important, but and some others, in order somehow to see how can we counterbalance this concept of will that leads through Augustine and Origen to Nietzsche and the will to power as absolute self-transcendence and this idealistic realization of the subject, which even in Nietzsche remains a Christian subject. It is a Christian subject, though he tries to correct the inconveniences. And the other possible, say, course of the will, which is for me what I call will to consubstantiality, will to restore the broken nature. So in very few words, just to give try to give an outline. I mean, I don't know if it is enough in order to start this discussion.
Mark, you have reviewed Nicolas's book, and you've made some very insightful comments on this whole question, where in a way Nicolas is taking up the old question of Tertullian. What has Athens to say to Jerusalem? So Mark, would you like to take it over?
Sure, and thank you for having me, Tom. It's a delight to be here. Let me just say a little bit about my own background that I'm bringing to the reading of this book, and then say why I find this book to be fascinating and I think quite valuable and needful for a lot of people to read. So I'm coming to this book from a philosophical background. My own training is in scholastic philosophy, primarily Thomas Aquinas, but not just Thomas Aquinas, as well as in phenomenology. But in the last 6 or 7 years, I have been reading Maximus and Palamas and some of these people. And my personal overall project, which really attracted me to this book, is a desire to give a holistic anthropology of the human person. And Nicolas in this book does that admirably. So I think one of the things that the book does particularly well is set up this very nice contrast between these two different models of the human person that Nicolas talked about. So on the one hand, the model that he spent the most amount of time just now talking about is this will to power model. This view of the self as primarily consciousness, as primarily experience, as primarily something sort of at the end of the day that's idealistic, right? Not real, not concrete. A view of the person entirely as self-determined. And you can see sort of the narcissism that he talked about built into that. And the other model of the person is this view of the person as something concrete, as something that is not merely a soul or a consciousness or an experience, but something that is a union of soul and body, right? of consciousness and the material, where what we are is not primarily the soul, but that whole package deal, as it were, and where our will is this openness of the entirety of what we are for all of being and ultimately for God. And Nicolas at a couple of points sets up the contrast between these two models in terms of what he calls a model of an ecstasis, a flight from nature, and an ecstasis of nature. So the nihilist model, the narcissist model, the one that he traces back to Origen and Augustine, is this flight from nature. Nature, the concrete, the material, the historical, is something that separates us from ultimate being and that we need to rise above or escape from. And the other model, which he finds in people like Maximus and Gregory Palamas, but also I think maybe a little bit in Thomas Aquinas and some of his followers, is this view on which there is an ekstasis of nature, where nature and history and materiality and the body and everything that we are is taken up into God. And I think that contrast of the ekstasis of nature and the ekstasis from nature beautifully puts these two models. Now, I find this extremely valuable for at least three reasons. So one reason is I think it does a really good job of diagnosing a lot of problems in the spiritual life. So something that I'm really interested in is, I mean, not just as a philosopher, but as a Christian, is why is Christian spirituality so abysmally bad at transforming people's lives? Why aren't more people sort of made to have a greater religious life, moral life, interpersonal life, and so forth? And I think Nicolas provides us with a really insightful diagnosis that the model of the human person on which much of Christian spirituality, East and West, is founded is nihilistic. Or as he puts it, and I think this is a really great point, it's docetistic. That is, fundamentally, it's a failure to accept the fact of the incarnation, that God became a concrete human being, and rather seeing it merely as a sort of taking on of an appearance or the mere experiences of a human being. Another thing that I find particularly, a second thing that I find particularly insightful about this book is it makes sense of the things that Christians actually do. So what do Christians do? Christians do liturgy. Christians do the sacraments, right? These concrete bodily material acts. And on the Augustine origin flight from nature model, these things are sort of merely occasions for grace, occasions for an interior experience. On Nicolas's model, which he's drawing from Maximus and Palamas and Simeon, the New Theologian, and people like this, these things that we do, these material things like eating the Eucharist, these are the actual place where we encounter God, right? Where we in all of our bodiliness are taken up into the divine life. So it takes the things that Christians actually do and makes them actually central to a Christian anthropology. Last thing I'll say that I find this book particularly helpful on is that it sort of cuts across the East-West polemics that often plague these sorts of discussions. So Nicolas is quite upfront. The blame, so to speak, for this nihilistic, idealized model of the human person lies in both traditions, right? Not just in Augustine, but in Origen as well. Now, it seems to be that the Eastern tradition provides more of the solution, and I found that convincing as well. Nevertheless, the roots of the problem, and so the need to address the problem, lie in both traditions, not just in one or the other.
Loudovikos, if I could come back to you, do you feel that that's a representation of some of the important issues that your book is addressing?
Yes, absolutely. I thank Mark for this. It's just excellent. And that was my intention. And that is my problem. When let me tell you, I was an atheist before in my youth. When I entered the church, I entered the church precisely because I wanted to stop to finish with idealism, you know. And I found, in a way, the same say elan disguised now in hesychasm, for example. When I mean, my first experience with hesychasm was absolutely terrible, horrible. And this has to, you know, this is why I somehow, yes, dedicated a great part of my intellectual activity in order to find new terms. I have found some almost a dozen of terms in order to explain all these things in absolutely human and today's experiences. I mean, for example, instead of speaking of say transcendental communion, I prefer the term that I have entered, either meaningfulness, to create meaning together. So instead of speaking of uncreated energies and, how is, you have some meat, have to somehow to passively see the light and, I'm using the terms intersubjective sin energy, which is to act together with God. And this is the very essence of what we call contemplation of God, for example. And in order to speak of, a way of addressing God and, feeling, the grandeur and, the height, the weathering height of his, I employ the term analogical ecstasies, putting Maximus in discussion with Heidegger and Plotinus and Lacan, where ecstasy is not analogical. We have ecstasies in Heidegger from both sides, but they cannot meet. We have ecstasies in Plotinus, but only from the part of the human. And it is impossible to have ecstasy in Lacan because it's paranoid. You admit that you can melt with the other. So it comes Maximus and says, look, there is an ecstasy, but this is dialogical ecstasy. This is Chalcedon. You speak and you say silly things and God listens to you and transforms himself to your silly, understanding of him and treats you like a baby, but a beloved baby. And then he goes on with you step by step as a good father. And this is, in scholarly speaking, analogical, say, ecstasies. I mean, you meet another at the end of the impulse. It's just a blind impulse. It's just an impulse. It's a, So, and a great part of my activity is just this. The extent of the next book, of course, and then I also want to write this book was designed as a trilogy, a book on the unconscious, a theology of the unconscious. I realized as an old psychologist, I realized that there are many, many, many wonderful things that theology can tell about the unconscious, and somehow lead the psychologists who are, feel blind, in order to understand what's the intention of having an unconsciousness. What is the, And of course, I like very much what Marx said about the end of the cultural wars, as I call them. Now the world has become one. We are one. We speak the language. I was thinking, now I'm going to express myself in English, but I grew up with English. I started learning when I was 7 or 8 years old. So, you see, which is something new, and in this sense, I insist in both my English and Greek books on this new term, which is the Christian Greek Western world, where the convergences are invaluable. If I could put Palamas and Thomas Aquinas in a round table, they could discuss and have a passionate discussion and be friends with each other. This is what we have forgotten through the cultural wars. But for the Christians, this has to stop, because the Christian church is a phenomenon much, much, much wider, universal. It is universal. Yes, please.
Mentioning the Christian Greek Western world is a perfect thing, because if there's one person who comes to mind for this, it's Andreas. Andreas, I know you wanted to come in on this conversation.
Yes.
Andreas is a Greek Western.
He is indeed, and he's a great theologian as well. And he's a friend of mine. What more can you ask for?
Yeah.
Now, Father Nikolaos, I think that you have provided us with so many entry points for many discussions. And of course, we're just covering a very small tip of the iceberg here. But there are many things in your book, many things that you covered already in your presentation here, that I found fascinating and quite unexpected for the average reader. And this was one of them. So I reacted immediately when I heard you mention it again, because I was very impressed when I read it in the book. And actually, this is not one of your conclusions. It's a basis that you start with. this Greek Western Christian world. And one of my questions, and I suspect that to some extent you have already addressed it, is so you're saying you have spoken in the book about the convergence of East and West in the context of precisely what you describe as the Greek Western Christian world. And I was wondering if you have any idea of what would this convergence look like. Now, I suspect, and I wonder if this is what one of the things that you have in mind is that you provide this kind of service by creating new terms, concepts, and definitions and descriptions that can be much more relevant in our modern philosophical and theological language, and maybe of equal weight both in the East and the West. So was that a motivation for you to, as you said, to come up with new definitions, with new descriptions for some of the old concepts? And I can absolutely see that this provides a service. It allows us to talk with much more precision. We understand these concepts much more than the quite elusive concept of energies. Well, you can translate or understand energia in so many different ways, and this is such a source of confusion. So, how do you see this? Do you see a connection between the Greek Western Christian world and your new terminology, as it were? Your new terminology.
You remind me of an experience that I had in a conference in Moscow some years ago. The topic of the conference, I was invited to talk with others there. The subject was Simeon the New Theologian. So I chose a subject called a fading self and its fragmented body. Desire and Lacan and Simeon the New Theologian. So I created a scandal in Moscow. So all the traditional scholars raise their hands and think, so what are you doing here, Father? And you're a Greek, you come here to teach us, and you are waiting for, this is what we're waiting from you, to teach us, the genuine Simeon, the theology of Simeon, San Simeon. And you're somehow melting it with Lacan and create this discussion. And if Lacan is right, is wrong, then how can we, go on with this? I said, then look, yes, I find Simeon's theology fascinating, but the way you understand your body today, and your desire, your fragmented body, and your broken desire can be explained through Lacan. So Lacan shows you the way to understand Simeon in your present condition, which is most important for me, to understand my problem through Simeon, and not to understand Simeon in general. For me, this is, I had a very good teacher in hermeneutics when I was in the Institut Catholique de Paris student, which was Jean Grèche, so a good philosopher, perhaps. Mark knows about him. He had written a 3-volume work, L'Age herméneutique de la raison, which is very, very, very good. And hermeneutics is, and phenomenology in general, it can be invaluable for these explorations. Just how to show you, you have to see things as they are in yourself. It's you and the problem of your death. It's you and the problem of your corrupted, your fading self. And this self is fading. Why? Because your desire is broken into many, many, many parts. Here we have the miracle. Lacan says that, if your desire is broken in many, many parts, it becomes weak. And Simeon says the same thing. If you do not unify your desire, you're going to faint. You as a selfhood, and of course, this makes you understand how precious is, the suggestion made by Simeon, the new theologian, is somehow that the will, the desire for something absolutely invaluable in order to somehow cut it into many pieces and disperse your nature and so many things and so many objects of desire, and finally lose yourself. I gave just a paradigm, an example of the many that I have and to give that happened to me in many times in different forms. But for me, it's important that I address myself. I address God, through what I really think of myself and history, and through what I really am, and not just someone who knows the history of ideas or history of spirituality, in a vague way. I don't know if there's an answer to your.
That is an excellent answer.
Yeah.
I see Mark nodding.
Yes.
So can I move straight back to Mark?
Sure, thank you. So this is enormously helpful. So often when Christians, non-Christians, anybody does metaphysics, does systematic theology, it's in these very abstract terms, right? It's sort of a conceptual game, and you sort of make the right moves within the game and see if you get the right answer to come out. And what I find so valuable about what you're saying right now about this Greek Western synthesis that you're doing is that it's so rooted in experience, right? It's rooted in our actual concrete engagement with the world, whether that be this fragmentation of desire that you're talking about, or our experience of the material world and material history that you talk about in the book. And it seems that if this culture war within the church is going to be overcome, and I think also just sort of in the intellectual world more broadly, if philosophy, if theology is going to be actually relevant to actual people's lives, it's going to need this sort of concrete grounding in experience. And our metaphysical terms are going to have to stop being these abstract conceptual games and be the sorts of terms that you are, that you're talking about, where they're actually grounded in real life. So I find that quite valuable, that metaphysics and systematic theology can sort of be spirituality, not in the negative sense that you use it in, but in the sense of our actual religious lives.
Positive sense, absolutely. Yes, yes. When I speak of, if you allow me, when I speak of the Greek Western world, I don't speak of sort of, external harmony or just an agreement. I speak of a good discussion, a really good discussion, which is very important. It's important to know the corners of the thought, not only, in general, if you ask me, today in Greece, we celebrate, the feast of St. Augustine, today. Augustine is celebrated as a saint in the Orthodox Church. You see, that means that all this possible discussion put aside, the man was a saint, was a great saint. And the first book that I read when I entered the church was the Confessions. And I have somehow connected this book by my own repentance, the Confessions. So that means that there are many levels of this discussion, and this is what is important for the intellectuals is to make them clear. In order just, to make some clear-cut statements, this is West, this is East, this is Catholic, this is Orthodox. So I put several years of my life into the dialogue, between Catholic and Orthodox. I was the secretary for many years of this academic dialogue, the St. Irenaeus group. So, and that was a very, very rich experience. If we speak to one another, we find, solutions. If we speak as representatives, of different, churches, just as these. We say things that we don't believe sometimes. I remember something that happened to me, which is very characteristic. I had a question about Lumen Gentium. I had a question, so I put it in the synaxes there, in the gathering of the colleagues. I said, look, I like this, but I have a problem with that. And I have a problem. And I remember there was a professor, perhaps from Germany, that was asked to respond to what I said. Anyway, he responded, said, look, I love Greece very much. I like the Greek islands and the Greek sun, and I like going holidays in Greece. And I was somehow surprised. What are you talking about? And in the break, I met him, said, look, what I say, it's not nonsense. That's all the Orthodox have the same question. And he turned to me and said, and many Catholics, and many Catholics too. So this discussion for me is invaluable, and it was impossible to happen some decades ago.
Andreas, I know that you are interested in the whole relationship between Maximus and Nietzsche, and for most people who are watching this seminar, they're two utterly irreconcilable figures who have they don't even speak to one another. So over to you, Andreas.
This is precisely what I would like to ask Father Nikolaos, because you just said that in some ways you had Simeon the New Theologian converse and exchange ideas with Lacan, and I think this makes a lot of sense as you filtered through your own experience. In the same vein, in the same direction, it seems to me that one of the foundations of your thought in analogical identities is precisely Nietzsche. You say that very explicitly. And one of the central figures, one of the central theologians that you have worked with for a very long time is also Maximus. Now, it is not accidental, and of course you talk about it in various ways in your book, that one of the main questions for both of them is the question of will. Now, I don't know that there is an easy answer or any answer to this, but I wonder, in the same ways that you connected Lacan and Simeon the New Theologian, what could Maximus and Nietzsche talk about if they were to meet? They have
about the will.
Yes, of course, but in what ways would their understanding be compatible or not compatible? Because as Tom said, these are two thinkers that rarely people put together. And yet it seems to me that in your approach, you place them next to each other in a very natural way. And this is what I would invite you to say a little more about.
Thank you very much for this very, very important question, dear Andreas. Thank you. Well, my answer can be provocative for some. I think that Nietzsche and Maximus would have a very, very good discussion in the very subtle point of what the will finally is expressing. For Maximus, the will expresses nature. It's the nature of will. The nature as its whole, as a whole. It's not the Aristotelian will. It's not a will that, thinking first, can I fly? I cannot fly. So I cannot will, to fly. This is Aristotle. Maximus says, do I wish to fly? Yes, I would like to fly. And this is my desire. Please, God, help me. And this is culture. This is made possible. And Nietzsche would like this very much. The problem would start, I think, when Nietzsche, somehow discovers that his Protestant God is dead, because it's a moral God. It's the God of the this misled moral philosophy, and this God is dead. So Nietzsche has only the God of his father. His father was a priest, a pastor, Protestant in his mind, and this God was dead. So this will can only become self-transcendence in order to find, your inner experience of the self, because there's no other outside to address. So this is the moment that Nietzsche becomes atheist in a sense. But perhaps Maximus could even lead him, could even guide him, could advise him, in the second step. So it's very important, because what philosophy lost, and I'm trying to describe this briefly in my book, is precisely this sense of will, which is an affirmation of nature, and finally leads to a unification of the fragmented nature. I am a piece of human nature, and Tom is another piece of human nature, and Mark is another piece of human nature, and Andreas is another. By the way, love each other. We're friends. So the mystery of the cross, this responsibility, we embrace each other, and finally, I'm not alone. I have your, advantages and your good, aspirations and your goodwill and your abilities, and I have everything. And I become, as we say in English, pananthropos. I become everything. I am one, but I'm everything. And this is what I call consubstantiality, which is an analogical consubstantiality, because it comes from God, transferred to us through Christ, because we need the mystery of the cross to achieve this. You understand? I need to see you as God sees you. In the positive part of you, as a promise, as an open promise, which this is what each one of us is for God. So in this sense, you see that the will to power concludes with a self-transcendence, because it's alone. It's the type of inwardness, as I call it in my book. I have two types in page 259. The first is the type of analogy of energy or synergy or dialogue, the analogy of dialogue, you know that? Yes, this one. And the B is the type of inwardness, where the person is mainly the soul, whoever the transcendental unity itself, access from nature, will to power, methodology of the self. Methodology starts from Plotinus, but concludes with Nietzsche. The superhuman, this is the methodology of the ego. You see how close are those being ideas. The ego.
Because I'll tell you a funny story about page 259. When no one would want to know how many manuscripts come over my desk, and you usually have the very hard task of telling authors, okay, well, I'm sure I know you've put a great deal of work into it, but this is not the series for me. But then you also get a moment of insight, and you realize that no matter what happens, even if there's bits that you haven't liked or you haven't agreed with, there's something that says to you, this book needs to be published. But actually it was page 259, and that's why I have a marker on page 259. And for anyone who reads the book, could I make a suggestion? Go to page 259 first, because it will actually give you a guide to what you will find in the rest of the book. And I'm glad to see you're all nodding, because it means that I'm not alone in that. But can I come in with a question? Mark said earlier that he was very worried about Christian spirituality, which effectively makes no difference. It just doesn't work. I'm terrified by the number of times I read theologians, and I read books on the incarnation, and I listen to sermons on the incarnation, and the incarnation really could be, it really is just a matter of transmitted information. I now have the right information. And so there's an interesting docetism. It's not a docetism that's related to the person of Jesus. It's a docetism that you think Christianity is having the right set of codes, as if it were God has written the right book. Now, my urgency always is to try and get to a gritty incarnation. That one, you know, Mark said you meet it in liturgy, you meet it in sacraments, you meet it when we gather and sit and eat together. But we also discover the presence of God in the grittiness of our lives. Now, how do we communicate that, Nicolas?
I call it a holy materialism. This is how I call Christianity. Forgive me if I'm wrong. I call it a holy materialism. And because this is what that fascinates me in Christianity, precisely. It is important when a theologian from the US wrote me an email about this book and said, you know, I am my soul, it's me. You know, this is the problem. I am, what are you talking about there? You know, what are you talking about in this book? I mean, the soul is the human being. You know, there are Christian theologians and philosophers who believe this, that the soul, both Roman Catholic, some of them are Catholic, some of the Protestant, some of them Orthodox. You know, some of the names can be found in the pages of my book. And this is a way to put incarnation aside. What do we need the incarnation for? For me, this is the most important question. Can we have this infusion of divine life in my materiality? That's my only problem. Do we need the resurrection of the dead? Do we need this? If we don't need this, then we don't need Christianity. We can, you know, I love Greek philosophy very much. Andreas knows this. You know, in my book is my last book is on Greek philosophy, but I saw also the emphasis, and the emphasis is precisely this: that finally, through Plato, Greek philosophy became representation and transcendence.
I can see that both
Heraclitus. Heraclitus would like to be different, but things different. But Plato finally won the game.
I can see at this point that both Andreas and Mark both want to get in. So, Andreas, you go first, and then Mark.
I have a very brief question, because you already started addressing this, but there is so much stress on the incarnation in your book and your thought in general for all the reasons that you mentioned. And you also explained in various ways how there's a great confusion about mysticism. And I don't know if there is a good answer to this one. Why is mysticism still enchanting to many people, especially and is very often given as one of the spiritual allures of the East? I think that there's a great misunderstanding there. But
yes,
why are people still fascinated by mysticism, whatever that may mean?
I have a note here from the Cambridge Dictionary of Philosophy. I didn't know that you could put this question, of course. What is mysticism? A doctrine maintaining that one can gain knowledge of reality that is not accessible to sense perception or to rational conceptual thought. This is the temptation. We can't go beyond. But this is a dream. It's not true. Psychoanalysis knows that this is not true. And it's not true just because you can imagine this. and a great part of this imagination is a way also to read philosophy, parts of philosophy. For example, in another book of mine, I published, Andreas knows, two books, because of the coronavirus. I was, you know, without many obligations. So I finished some books. One of them before that, the last class, it was on the rise of the velvet totalitarianism. It is called the open history of its enemies. So, and I'm writing there on the impasses of enlightenment, and none of them. I make a comment upon Kant. When Kant speaks, says, you know, that you must do. Oh, first, let's take Hegel. When Hegel says that the logos, the spirit, you know, somehow takes his consciousness in you, that means that what you say, what you're thinking, is said by the spirit. You understand what the tragedy is? When the spirit, you know, finds himself in me and speaks through me, that means what I say comes from the spirit. Or take Kant. When Kant says his imperative, his famous imperative, that you must do what you do in order for, you know, for this to can be, you know, a measure and a way of, you know, acting for all human beings. A Nazi, you know, Hitler himself could say that this is true. I'm killing the Jews. This is what all human beings have to do. You see, what the imagination is very strong in philosophy. That means narcissism. That means finite the will to power. This is why we desperately need Christianity, which stands upside down and tells you, no, it's not a real other. No, it's not God that you imagine. You have to, you know, somehow follow this and this and this on the fight him. And I think that this is very important. This is very important.
Quite specifically, as you have explained it, incarnational Christianity.
Yeah?
As you have explained it, incarnational Christianity.
Incarnational Christianity, and somehow we put it in parentheses.
Okay, Mark.
Parentheses.
Yeah, I want to ask more about that. So I want to hear more about this this holy materialism, not theoretically, but sort of in terms of its practical implications for how we should be living Christianity, right? A lot of people are going to, when they describe, say, what Christians do as Christians, it's going to be in mystical terms or in spiritual terms in the negative sense that you gave it. And even when you were, Nicolas, when you were talking a few minutes ago, when you were talking about this analogical consubstantiality that we can achieve with one another, you yourself described it in primarily sort of conscious terms, right? Like we all love each other, we all know one another and so forth. But I think your position goes deeper than that, if I'm not wrong about this. That is that the sort of consubstantiality we can have with each other, the sort of analogicity we can have with each other is not just an experience of love or an experience of knowledge or an experience of openness. It's something sort of deeper than consciousness. It's something in our bodies, right? It's something that not just that what we do, but something that we are, right? In a very concrete way when we engage in some set of Christian practices and so forth. So could you talk more about that? Like what should we be doing and thinking of here?
One of the reviewers of the book, a very good reviewer, noticed that I finally prefer to speak in ontological terms, not just in moral or psychological terms. That means that somehow I'm constructed through this consubstantiality. For me, when I speak of consubstantiality, this is explained further in my new book. I speak the ide-givenness. I mean the ide-givenness of essence. I mean, we have three persons, but the essence is one. Is one. Why? Because it is either given, timelessly, pre-eternally, not in the sense that someone has it and gives them, but so a mode of existence. The essence, the one nature of God, exists through being constantly given. This is the primordial dialogue. Consubstantiality is the primordial dialogue. When I give everything that I have, what I give to my wife, I'm a married priest, as Mark is married, I think. Okay, so what I have given to my wife or to my children, I have given a good part of myself, but not all of it. This is a dream for us to be given, as Marion says, you know, and very, very important, Marionis, very important for all of us, for all Christians, not only for the Catholics. So I'm being given, but how much? For God, this means the totality of his being, is given. The givenness is the very definition of his mode of existence. So, and what is most important is that although he's given substantially, Father gives all of his essence to the Son. The persons remain intact. He's always the Father. The otherness remains intact, while essence is totally given. If you speak to a psychoanalyst who says, Heinz Kohut, for this total givenness, he says, no, this is a distraction. Don't do this. You will lose absolutely your narcissism. So that means the depression. Keep something for yourself. Just use the other and accept that you're using the other, and let him use too. Let me use you too. And that is but Trinity is a program which has to do with ontology. That means that when I'm given to the other, I remain intact, and this is, sanctity.
Let me cut in at that point, because I am reminded of the story told about Augustine and the little child trying to fill the ocean to the hole. And Augustine says, you can't do it. And Jesus says, and you're the guy who tried to explain the Trinity. So the mention of the Trinity raises a fundamental problem of theological discourse, and that is that every good theological discussion must end at some time, because human beings have to stop and eat and do other things, and our minds get tired. So we can only take it in small doses. But the discussion itself is unending, because God is ever greater. So I'm just glad that we've explored a couple of tiny issues, with big issues in a tiny way, for a few minutes, and we've shown that these are much bigger questions. Now, you hinted earlier, Nicolas, that this is the first part of a trilogy. When can we expect volume 2? Like, when will it arrive on this desk?
Volume 2 is almost ready, as I told you before. And the title that I'm thinking of, don't know if it is good, how do you find it, is Participation as Distribution. And the subtitle is The Self-Referring Subject and Christian Theology.
Okay. It
has 3 parts. The first part is called Theology of Analogical Consubstantiality and Patristic Tradition. This is the theological part. The first is Philosophy of the Self-Referring Subject and Patristic Theology. And the third is Psychoanalysis of the Detached Subject and Patristic Theology. So it's somehow an effort to go further in the same perspective.
Well, before you try to read volume 2, read volume 1. Let me thank the 3 of you. I think there's nothing as interesting as a spontaneous discussion between theologians who are engaged with their subject. And that's why I said to you when I wrote an email to you yesterday, don't bother with preparation. All you need to do is we'll just kick the ball out into the field.
Thank you for this. Thank you for this. It's wonderful.
So
I like it. Yeah.
Well, thanks to Mark, thanks to Andreas, and thanks to Nicolas, who, if he hadn't written the book, we wouldn't have the discussion. And lastly, thanks to you who are watching this on YouTube on your computer. I hope it's been an interesting example of how theology continually renews itself by bringing the past into dialogue with the present, but always with an eye on a better tomorrow. So Bene, legiter et feliciter. Read well and read happily.